On episode 134 of the Vincast, I chat with Nina Kaplan, wine and travel writer and author of The Wandering Vine. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and I could not be more excited about having another new episode of the Vincast available for your listening pleasure, which is actually the first recorded episode of 2018. I cannot believe that we are already in May, and I've only had one recorded episode. It has been a pretty hectic year so far, as I probably have mentioned on previous episodes of the podcast that I've released, and no doubt my YouTube channel as well. But I am endeavoring to finding more time, particularly now that we are post-vintage 2018, to sit down with more potential guests. And I'd love to hear from you, the listeners, as far as recommendations for guests you'd love to hear on the show, or even if you yourself would like to be on the podcast, please do get in contact with me at thevincast@gmail.com or via my website. I'd love to hear from you. I always appreciate any kind of contact, or particularly a review and rating on iTunes or any other podcast sharing app or platform. But for the new episode, I am excited to share a chat that I had with a woman named Nina Kaplan, who is a journalist and writer based in London, who was in Melbourne recently to release her first book, The Wandering Vine, which I have been sent a copy, and I am just absolutely ravenously devouring myself. And it was great to find out about her background and her personal journey with wine that led her to write this book. So I hope you do enjoy the episode. Please do hang on until the end of the episode to find out how you can get in contact with Nina and myself. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Nina, thank you very much for making some time whilst you're here in Melbourne to be on the Vincast. Welcome, and sounds like you've got a really fun time to spend here. But thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I start every episode of my podcast asking my guest if they can remember if there was a particular interaction they had with wine at a certain point that was a slightly more profound experience and kind of maybe set them on the path to more interest and possibly career in the wine industry.
Well, actually, I never intended to have a career in the wine industry. The profound moment for me was a very long drawn out one, because my father was very interested in wine. He was a wine connoisseur. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up with good wine at home. Sure. And grew interested in wine that way. And I think at some point I was an arts journalist and talked about wine so much that at some point somebody said, well, why don't you write something then? So there wasn't really a specific moment. There were just lots and lots of good wines at home, and I was always permitted, even when quite young, to try them. And was the experience, as far as the way that your father or your parents enjoyed wine, like social experience and with food, that kind of thing? Did that kind of play into it at all? Oh, absolutely. So we had a big round table, big oak table, which actually comes into my book because it was so important in my growing up. And my father, who when my parents split up, wasn't able to boil an egg, realized that you couldn't be a wine connoisseur and have rubbish food. Right. So he learned very quickly and became a very good, very high-end cook. And so there were a lot of dinner parties and lunch parties, and I very early on got the sense that good food, good wine, and good conversation were inextricably linked. Whereabouts did you grow up? London, so Clapham in South London. So both my parents are actually from Melbourne. They grew up here, they met here, got married here, and then they moved to England, and then they had children there. So right, okay. I was born there, but with all my relatives still in.
So growing up in London, or particularly your father living in London, would have been great as far as getting access to a lot of different wines. He was a connoisseur, you say. Did he like to explore different wines, or did he have particular favourites?
I would say both. I mean, he absolutely, he liked to explore different wines. He was always very interested in Australian wine, which in England in the late 1960s and early 70s was a problem. Apparently there was one Oddbins off license with one shelf of Australian wine, and you'd meet the same sort of 3 or 4 people who were all expat Aussies, who at that point were the only people interested in good Australian wine as opposed to the plonk. But he loved being so close to Europe, and he loved Rhone wines and Bordeaux and Burgundy and Italy and Spain to a lesser extent. But I think the sort of the privilege for an Australian of being able to, it wasn't quite pop to those countries then. There was no EasyJet then, but still, in comparison to coming from Australia, it was pretty close.
And did he share wine with you? Did you kind of get introduced to wine by him, or was it more observation and later you came to enjoy wine on your own?
No, I did. I mean, my father was a very practical man, and at some point he realised he had 2 teenage daughters, and he better do something to ensure that the wine that was all over the house, because he built a cellar and then he just filled up the house again, and then he put wine in storage and then he just filled up the house again. And if he didn't want that wine to go to people who would really not appreciate it, he had better take steps to ensure that didn't happen. So there was one section in our kitchen, and wine there was for me and my sister to drink once we were of an age where that was appropriate.
Right.
And his logic was, look, you're going to spend £3-4 on a bottle of wine, as it would have been then. I'm going to spend the same, and it's his money anyway at that stage. I will buy better. Mm-hmm. So what I got to drink at that point was good plonk.
Right.
But it was a strategy that came with risks. I do remember him accidentally leaving a bottle of Penfolds Grange, as it still was then, too close to this section of the kitchen. My sister, my 18-year-old sister and her friends, opening it and insult to injury, not liking it very much, drinking half, leaving the rest to go off. I mean, he was...
If it was still young, it probably would have been a little bit inaccessible. Like they probably wouldn't have seen much as well. Being a slightly more elegant wine, you would think, than the stuff that they would usually drink.
Oh, definitely. To be honest, I can't remember how old it would have been. It wouldn't have been young if it was still called Penfolds Grange, which I think it was. But
Grange Hermitage.
Yeah, it was. No, it was Penfold. It's not. It was. Yeah, it was. You're
the
right.
Grange isn't the problem. The Hermitage was the problem.
The Grange wasn't a problem. The Hermitage was a problem. You're absolutely right. And I'm pretty sure but I don't know when they stopped doing that. I can't remember offhand when they stopped doing that.
It was like the mid to late 90s.
Oh, well, yeah, it definitely would have been before that. So yes, you're probably right. It probably was just too young. But to be honest, at 18, they probably just had a couple of drinks and then, went off to go clubbing or something. Sure. I don't know. I've always remembered it.
Got any vodka?
Yeah, exactly. But the rest of the time, it was a strategy that worked very well.
Right.
And when I went off to university, he would give me wine to take up to university on the same basis, which made me very, very popular at university, but also was the beginning of what was then a totally spurious reputation as somebody who knew something about wine.
Right, okay. So it was like wine knowledge by association?
Yeah.
Right,
yeah, totally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did that make you popular at college?
I think you get respect for that at college, but ultimately, at the stage where no one can afford more than about £3 on a bottle of wine, it doesn't mean that much to people.
And they're probably not necessarily drinking wine, as a part of a meal. Sort of like, well, we drink wine because it's alcoholic and relaxes us and makes us feel good.
And it's a way to sit around in the bar, at the college bar, so I think...
And you feel sophisticated.
Yeah, not our college bar. I'm not sure I felt that sophisticated, but yes, it was more. They were more impressed by quantity than quality,
right?
Like that.
Absolutely. Therefore, good value was pretty high on the priorities.
Yeah.
What did you study at university?
French and Russian.
Language. Yeah. Wow. Okay. With any particular kind of idea of a path career-wise, or where did the passion for language studies come from?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, my mother spoke several languages. I always wanted to learn French, and Russian was, at the age of 18, I had this great idea I was going to read War and Peace in the original. And sadly, I never did, and now I certainly never will because I've forgotten most of my Russian. But no, and I do think that if you're interested in other cultures, and if you're lucky enough to have the opportunity and the ability to learn languages, you learn an awful lot about how other people think. And I do think that people think differently in different cultures, in different languages.
Most certainly.
And that a language as different as Russian, you really get a strong sense of that.
I also think that study of other languages gives you a better understanding and appreciation for your own language.
Yes.
Because, I remember when I was an exchange student in Japan, sitting in their English classes, thinking, how do you teach English? Because to my impression, like, it has no structure whatsoever. It's just completely random. And then I saw the way they would break up sentences in the same way that I learned Japanese. Well, not the same way, but in a similar way. I'm thinking, oh yeah, and you start to realize, oh, there is kind of a framework, there is kind of method to the madness. So I think that's a really great benefit to the study of languages as well.
Yeah, I agree.
So where did the study of languages take you?
Well, I always wanted to. Well, actually, where it took me was into film journalism. I was about to say I always wanted to be a film critic, but I always wanted to be a film critic because in my year off before university, one of the things I did,
Year.
I had a gap year, and I spent some of it here, but I spent some of it in Paris, improving my French. And they still have a lot of, and had even more then, of these old cinemas which show classics. And I just walked into a cinema one day and saw a film in the way that nobody sees films anymore, which is just because it happened to be showing, and fell totally in love with new wave French cinema, cinema from the 1960s. So yeah, the desire to be a film critic grew out of that. So yes, I guess my degree did in some way lead me towards the beginnings of my career.
And you felt more of an affinity to criticism or to analysis rather than to creation?
Well, I always wanted to write. So, but yes, I mean, I guess I could have wanted to be a screenwriter.
Sure.
But no, I really enjoyed being a film critic. For a while. It's an interesting challenge. The best thing I ever read about this was Pauline Kael, who was the film critic for the New Yorker for many years, saying if you're in a room full of people, you'll always know the people who really love film. They won't be the people talking about the films they loved. They'll be the people talking about what they loved in the films they hated.
Yes.
And I think it's the best. That's the best encapsulation of good criticism. Is not that you should be unendingly positive about everything, but that it's always easier to be negative, and that the challenge is to extract the good and also to convey what something is really like.
I think you basically summed up the problems with things like Yelp and TripAdvisor.
Oh, don't get me started on TripAdvisor.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and I guess it is really hard to be totally objective about something. So better to kind of find positives in something rather than just be negative about things. But like, of course, everyone can talk about why what they love, but say find value in something that you might not necessarily enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's impossible to be objective. By definition, we are subjects. We are subjective about things. But having a broader sense of what might be useful or interesting to someone else to hear, rather than I hated that or I love that, because that's you'd always, as a critic, I started as a film critic and I broadened out into other forms of arts journalism, and you would always get someone saying, I don't agree with you, in the outraged, how can you have got it wrong sense. But it's like, but it is your privilege to not agree with me, and it is my privilege to not agree with you. The important thing is, did you get anything of use or of interest out of reading what I wrote?
Yeah,
did it totally align with your views?
It's not like you're writing a review saying, I didn't like it, and it ends there. You're sort of saying, well, this is why. And if you disagree with the reasons, that's one thing. But if you just disagree because you did like it, well, that's sort of your problem, really.
And not terribly interesting to talk or write about, I think. Yes, I did, no, I didn't. It's not an interesting
It
argument.
ends up being that classic Monty Python's Flying Circus sketch where it's just contradiction rather than argument.
Yes.
Just the immediate naysaying. So how did you get into criticism and sort of journalism to begin with?
I started in business-to-business journalism and did lots of things for free. As in those days, doing lots of things for free got you a job in the end. These days, I think it just gets you more things to do for free.
Yeah.
But so I started writing for a magazine called Flicks, which was in cinemas then, long since defunct. And I what else did I do? I worked for the European, also defunct, but a very interesting sort of cross between a newspaper and a magazine that was trying to be a newspaper for Europe. And that was really useful, really good training. And then I helped launch Metro in the UK, which is and was a different company from the metros that are all over the world, and I think certainly were in Melbourne. I don't know if they still are.
The sort of the free press.
The free press. Yeah. So, but this was originally it's something very different now. But at the time, it was this great idea of let's have something that's free but not cheap.
Right.
And so the quality of the journalism was very high in the sense that the person who employed me was the ex-features editor of Time Out. She was a serious journalist with a really impressive background. And I learned tons working there, not least how to write briefly, because the articles, it was obviously intended to be on public transport. The articles were all very short. If you wrote blog length stuff, somebody would just hack it to death. Mm-hmm. So that was very good training.
Like a director who knows exactly how much to shoot rather than shooting long and then having to edit it down by 50% or more.
Well, you can, I tend to write long and edit down, but the important thing is I'm the one doing the editing.
Right.
And so
self-editing, yeah.
And then I went to Time Out. I ended up being features editor of Time Out, like my old boss, by coincidence.
Yeah.
And before that, I was the editor of a magazine called Metropolitan, which is the magazine on Eurostar, which is the train that runs between London and Paris.
I took it.
And that then at that point, my French was actually very useful because it's a bilingual. Well, technically, it's a trilingual magazine. Third language being Dutch/Flemish. It's effectively the same language.
Because it sort of connects up to.
It goes,
Belgium
it goes up to Brussels.
Yeah, okay.
But it's sort of 40% English, 40% French, 20% Dutch. So it was very useful.
So just different articles would be in different languages, or articles would be in multiple languages?
And it's translated, and not all of the articles get translated into Flemish. Some do, some don't. But all of the articles are in English and in French. So obviously it's very political to not seem to be preferring London over Paris in a train that runs principally between London and Paris.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah. Well, it kind of reminds me of often you find publications on airlines, often depending on where their airline is from, like it's a Japanese airline, something like that, that have it in Japanese and English in the articles.
Yeah. Okay. I think there are a lot of publications doing that, and in a sense, quite right too. Why should we expect everybody in the whole world to speak and read English well enough to enjoy an article?
Goodness gracious. Now you're talking about one of the main problems I had traveling in Europe is like, why do you expect everyone to be able to understand and speak English to your level? Why are you not even making the slightest bit of effort to at least learn some basic phrases in the country? Show some respect anyway.
Yeah. No. With that, I'm in complete agreement.
Rant over. And so as far as the kind of that analysis of art and film and kind of dissecting and identifying things that you did like about something that you possibly didn't love, did you find yourself doing that bit by bit with wine?
That's an interesting question. I'm not entirely sure.
Were you just sort of just enjoying wines and exploring that kind of thing?
I'm opinionated about everything. You don't end up as a critic entirely by accident, I think. So I am opinionated about wine too. But what I really, really found attractive about wine is the stories that it comes with.
Yes.
And those can be historical, they can be geographical, geological, political, artistic. There are so many different stories attached, and I find it a little bit of a pity that most wine writing is very much concentrated on tasting notes and where this came from, how it was made. And with all due respect, because those things are really important, but not everybody is as interested in those things. And I do believe most people are interested in a story of some kind. So that was really what drew me into wine properly, was wanting to tell some of those stories.
I think that is something that wine writers and wine marketers, to a certain extent, it is kind of a shame. It's a missed opportunity because the technical information, the sort of the more black and white, whilst that is a lot easier to talk about, it's not necessarily something that an audience and a lot of wine consumers are going to relate to. Then kind of a lot of the information, that's part of the reason why I think that they do think of it as elitist and inaccessible, and yet what they can relate to is people and stories about history and culture. I don't understand why a lot more of that is not talked about, and when it is talked about only in certain terms, and I guess it's pretty much why I started the podcast, really.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting because it's also very new. I mean, one of the things about, there's a lot of history in the book that I've just written, Wandering Vine, and some of it is about Roman history as relates to wine. And one of the things that you have there is we have no idea what those wines tasted like because nobody ever wrote about that. Tasting notes did not exist. That just wasn't that. I think up until really the 20th century, that's not what people were writing about when they were writing about wine. So it's a very, very new thing, but it's kind of taken over. And to me, in a sense, it's a bit like, if you pick up a novel that you love and somebody writes all about the grammar. I mean, it's not that stuff isn't important and of interest to some people, but it won't actually tell you very much about that novel as a novel. And I find it a shame also because I've given talks, for example, where people have been holding a glass of wine in their hands and have said to me, "What does it taste of?" As in, they're waiting for me to give them a tasting note, and I'm there thinking, "You're holding it, your palate, you have the right to choose." And this actually also comes back to my dad, who would give me a glass of wine and say, "What does this taste of?" And I'd say, "Raspberries." And he'd say, No, it tastes of strawberries." And the answer is no, it doesn't. I mean, I know there are obviously certain wines that people say the Syrah of the Northern Rhone tastes of black pepper, and that's fine. And quite often you can get that. But if you choose not to get that out of a wine, that is your right. And there's also the problem that a lot of the tastes of wine come from local products. So there will be tasting notes on Chilean wines, I've seen this, which relate to herbs that grow in Chile, say, that don't grow in England or Australia, that I might not know. It's a very personal thing, I think, whether you want it to be or not. And this drive for a sort of a lingua franca is a bit like getting everyone to speak English.
But this ultimately does come back to that whole objective subjective thing. And I remember reasonably early on in my kind of discovery of wine as a wine professional, visiting cellar doors in wine regions like Mornington Peninsula, Yarra Valley, and having staff sort of say, pour me a wine and say, "Oh, this is our Chardonnay, and what you're going to taste is," and it's like, don't tell me what I'm going to taste.
Exactly.
That's kind of like you're basically putting things into my head,
Yeah.
and then the worst case scenario, I don't taste that, and I think, oh, I don't know anything about wine, and that's where you are potentially going to be alienating wine consumers, and they kind of go, oh, well, obviously I don't know anything about wine, so I'll just keep buying my cheap wine. If you are kind of empowering people to think for themselves and that there are no wrong answers, and maybe some answers are more wrong than others, but that, what you might say lemon, I might say, something completely different, that's not necessarily wrong. That's just what you perceive, and everything is based on experience and perception. So, that was something that I really didn't like.
Well, it also, I mean, this is not open heart surgery, okay, where there are definitely going to be things, lots of things you need to know, and right answers and wrong answers. This is supposed to be fun.
Yes.
And telling people that they have got it all wrong, or they don't know anything, or even strongly implying those things is not fun for anyone. I mean, it's occasionally fun if you like looking down on people. And I think, again, this is where the problem can come in. Whereas actually, we are back to what we were talking about with regard to film criticism. You can disagree with me completely, and we can both get on totally fine.
Yeah.
Unless one of us says, no, you have to agree with me.
Yeah. Or that, your reasons are stupid. It's like, well, we can have a discussion about this and we can put arguments forward, and you might, think that I'm wrong, and that's completely fine. But don't just immediately dismiss me and say that's a stupid argument. That's pointless.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's not necessarily the way that we, consume things like film or wines or food. We're not necessarily kind of analyzing it in such detail and talking in beautiful prose about something. We're just enjoying it, and we're sharing it with people, and it's contextual. It's just that kind of analysis of wine is great, but it's really only for a very small number of wine consumers, and I think that too much focus is put on it. And again, it is just, for me, continuing this idea of wine as a sort of an elitist product, and it's and it's not kind of encouraging people to explore and be more confident with their own choices and what they do and don't enjoy.
Yes, exactly. And of course, in the time that I'm partly writing about, because it's my book is a travel book, so it's not a history book. But the interesting thing to me was that in Roman times, it wasn't about elitism. It was about being civilized. I mean, you drank wine if you were civilized. You drank diluted wine if you were civilized. And you didn't drink wine. I mean, the barbarians in Gaul were drinking beer, for instance. So it wasn't about, obviously there's an element of elitism to that, but it's, you too can be elite. Everyone can be included. Everyone can drink wine.
Yeah.
And if you don't effectively, you're in need of education.
There is an aspirational element to it, absolutely, but there's not. It's still kind of an inclusionary sort of thing. So come and be be elite, come and be sophisticated with us.
Have a glass of wine.
Yeah.
I mean, what could be nice and what could be, as opposed to you drink the wrong wine, stand outside.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a joyous and communal thing. Drinking wine, and that is what should be encouraged.
So was it the writing, journalism, criticism that gave you more of an opportunity to travel, and did you kind of take advantage of those opportunities to explore more wines, try more wines, visit wine regions possibly?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I was doing quite a lot of travel for sort of arts journalism, and it was just...
If I might interrupt, tell me what arts journalism is like. What form does that take?
Well, it took lots of forms, actually. Obviously, it started with film criticism. I wrote a bit about food and drink, even at that stage.
So when you say art, you mean like the arts as opposed to art?
Yeah, I wrote about art. I wrote about photography.
Yeah, cool.
Books, theatre.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as features editor of Time Out, I had a lot of opportunity to write about. And actually, at one point, that job transitioned into being arts editor. And my brief was to write across the arts in London,
right,
which is still, will always be the best job I will ever have. It was amazing. Time Out changed, life changed. That's fine. I'm still very happy with the job that I have. But at that point, I could treat one of a world's great cultural cities as my playground, mm-hmm. and that was fantastic. Mm-hmm. But yes, I did a lot of travel. I went to Japan, in fact, to write about 19th century Tokyo, Edo, for related to an exhibition, exhibition of woodcut art in London. I went to northern Italy to write about the architect Palladio. And and I would take the opportunity, not so much in Japan, but certainly in northern Italy. I was like, great, I'm going to toddle off and go. I went to see Allegrini, while I was there, and yeah, anywhere that had good wine, which actually Japan does now, but I didn't know about it at the time, and anyway, I had only 3 days. But anyway, anywhere else I went that had good wine, I would take the opportunity to sort of run away and play in a vineyard for a few hours or a few days.
And certainly being based in London, it has still obviously a thriving food and wine scene. So I'm sure there were plenty of wine bars and good retailers you could explore wines as well.
Good retailers has always been true. Good wine bars is true now, but that has changed a lot, actually. London has a great tradition of having all the world's wines, because until fairly recently, we didn't have any of our own. We did at one point have an empire with lots of winemaking areas. It's extraordinary because there was no protectionism, and there still isn't, because the English wine industry is very, very small. You can't protect it in the way that you can protect the Australian wine industry, for instance. So it's always been a great place to buy wine. It has not always been a great place to drink wine, because the tradition was more of people sort of buying wines, laying them down in their own cellars back when people had such things. And that has fortunately changed a lot. And now...
So it's more of a merchant culture.
It was definitely, nation of shopkeepers.
Sure.
It absolutely was. But now there are great wine. I mean, I'm talking about London. It's changing outside of London too, but it obviously more slowly. And I'm less knowledgeable about England outside of London. But there is a great wine bar culture now in London.
And so at what point did you sort of start? Did you do any writing about wine at all? Did that kind of feed into the writing you were doing at all?
It did. When I was at the European, which is very early in my career, at one point I asked if I could write about port for some reason. I can't remember what the rationale for this was. I can't remember very much about the piece or find it. Obviously, this is pre everything being online. But I was clearly already in my mid-20s interested enough that I went off and researched port and wrote a piece on port. And that, in retrospect, is a really nice thing, because it's one of the very few pieces I wrote about wine that my dad actually got to read, because he died in 2003. So at that point I was like, look, Dad, I've written a piece on wine. So it was very nice from that perspective. And one of the things I've written about quite a lot is that because he died pretty young, he was 65. Since then, it has become a way to carry on having a conversation with him. I taste wines. I taste wines that I know he would like quite often. I occasionally taste wines that taste familiar enough that I think I probably tried some version of them many years ago. And it's a way to sort of beat death, in a sense, is to carry on talking to my father through wine.
Before he passed away, did you have more opportunity to sort of share wines and explore with him?
A little bit. He kept coming out here to come to wineries out here, and at that stage, obviously in my 20s, I was no longer accompanying him. A little bit. We drank good wine together. Obviously, by that point, I was fully legal to do that. But it's really my interest in it became much stronger after he died, probably partly because as I've got older, it's become more and more of an interest, and partly because of losing him and wanting to keep things in common. And my partner is also very, very interested in wine, and actually we spend part of our time in Burgundy now, because my stepchildren, he has 4 children, and they are young and they are growing up in Burgundy.
Really?
That's also a good way to continue one's wine education.
Awful. What an awful place to be based.
It's it's a lovely place to be. It's actually, it's quite funny because it's actually not the bit that we're very close. We're like 50 kilometers from the bit that has the wineries.
Yep.
From the Côte d'Or, but we're in the bit that hasn't actually had much in the way of wine since phylloxera.
Sure.
So
can you imagine what France would have been like pre-phylloxera, and just vines everywhere?
Yeah, I think it really, really would have been. I mean, which is it, and still actually where we are. There are a couple of places that have started making wine around there again, but there's also a few people just who have a few vines in their background. They're maybe not even sure what kind of grapes it is. They've always been there. They make what probably isn't very good wine, and they probably drink it. So there's still that.
Why not?
Yeah.
I wish I could do that.
Probably could.
And so, more recently, how did you kind of find more of a pathway into writing more about wine and wine travel, and how did you kind of conceive of the idea of this new book?
The career change, such as it is, was accidental. That the world changed, and people were asking me more and more to write about wine and food and travel, and less to write about the arts, which is a very, an indication of a sad time for the arts. I
Very
think
much so,
certainly
yeah.
in the UK. I don't know so much about here.
Not just in terms of print media, but just in general, as
In
far as
general.
funding, like government funding for arts projects.
Yeah, exactly, and levels of interest among print publications, sadly, as well. So, and I've been writing my column for the New Statesman since 2011. So that's given me lots of opportunities to travel and to talk to winemakers, and it's just there is always more to do. There is always more to see and to learn. It's one of the things that I love about wine is you're never going to get to the bottom of it, so to speak. So there's that, but it was also the impulse behind the book was partly wanting to talk about these other sides of wine, the historical side, its ability to triumph over death, its and the fact that the vine travels. The vine has been traveling for a long time, largely not exclusively thanks to the Romans and their expanding empire and them taking vines and planting vines. And as somebody who, I'm first generation English, my parents were first generation Australian, their parents were sort of chucked out of Eastern Europe for being Jewish, either the beginning of the 20th century or in the middle of the 20th century. We are a wandering people too, and I think that's something that I have in common with the vine.
Well, if you think about the global wine industry, a large part of that is because of the British Empire.
Yes, that's true. Everything comes back to something else. There is no such thing as a type of wine or a type of vine that has no relation to those things around it, and I find that very interesting.
One of the things I love about wine is the fact that time has so many different kind of ways of moving, in that whilst wine is very fast moving and trends constantly changing, and there's always a new exciting some seemingly undiscovered region to talk about, there is the fact that grapevines take a long time before they reach maturity and start to be more in tune with their environment and produce better quality fruit to make better wines. And there are so many great wines that do require a lot longer for them to be ready to be consumed and at their best. I love the fact that things move at different speeds with wine.
And I think you really see that with winemakers. I've met winemakers who say, this wine I'm making today, I won't drink it. My son will drink it, or my daughter will drink it, or my grandchildren will drink it. And there's a kind of a more easeful relationship with, in a sense, with one's mortality. That this idea that that's okay because that's how things work. The vine moves in cycles. Humanity also moves in cycles. And a sort of a comfort with that I think most of us, especially those of us who live in cities, really lack.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for example, someone who plants new vines and they say, well, I'm probably never going to see these at their best, but my children will.
Yes, exactly.
They'll hopefully they'll continue on after me, and they're going to have the benefit of it, and that'll keep happening. Yeah. Hopefully. So as far as wine and travel, where have been some of the most profound experiences for you?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I actually, for the book, I would say going to Campania, so south of Rome, and talking to people who are trying to revive vineyards that were famous 2,000 years ago.
Are you possibly thinking of Mastro Berardino?
Mastro Berardino is definitely one of them, and the other one is...
They're doing it at Pompeii?
Yes, and Villa Matilde as well.
Yes.
So, he's a very interesting guy. His father sort of revived the whole idea of this sort of legendary wine, Falernian, that the Romans write about and considered so good it would keep for 200 years, which you got to wonder about that. But they are making really beautiful wines in more or less the same place.
Right.
And yeah, so there are people who are in touch with the next generation, and these are people who are in touch with a lot of generations in the past. I found that really, really interesting. Coming to Australia and going to vineyards here, actually, I love Australian wine, which still doesn't have a great reputation in England because we've had too much Australian plonk come in, and Australian plonk is great too at what it does, but I find it very frustrating how many people don't realise what really great top end wines there are coming out of Australia. A lot of them not coming out of Australia, staying here, but we do get very, very good Australian wine. So going to places like the Mornington Peninsula or the Yarra Valley or Margaret River, and being able to try and convey to people back home what they're missing out on if they think that all Australian wine is the sort of £5 cheapo schmeepo. That's also been very important. And the third place I would say would be the Rhone, because the Rhone is a place that most easily to me mingles what have been, while I've been writing a book about wine and the Romans, my two main interests. So you've got the fantastic wines of the Rhone Valley, which are there because the Romans brought vines and planted them there. And you've also, coming out of the soil in a quite a similar way, it seems, got all these incredible monuments and remains of that time in the past when this was a centre of Roman commerce and the Roman Empire.
So tell me about how you conceived of the idea of the book and where the particular interest in the Romans came from.
Well, partly it was going to Rome. We took my 4 stepchildren to Rome in 2015, and one of the things that we did was we went to see Titus's Arch. And on the inside of Titus's Arch, which is 2,000 years old and was built to glorify the victory over the Jews in the Roman Jewish Wars, which resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple and the Jews being forced out of Judea. And this, there is an incredible, they decorated it with the triumphal procession. So you've got all these Romans, you've got all these Jewish slaves that they've captured, and the menorah, the 7-branched candlestick from the temple, it was loot from the temple, is on there. And I looked at this and I thought, this is so interesting. This is a part of my heritage as a modern and totally non-religious Jew, but interested in my past. And it brought home to me that the Jews were sent traveling by the Romans, and because I think about wine a lot, I thought, but so was the vine to a large extent. So was the vine, and so I got interested in trying to tie those things together. And they are tangentially related, but they are related.
Well, they're certainly, yeah. I mean, when you think about the Jews, they did spread to various and far-flung parts of Europe and took roots.
Yes.
In the same way that grapevines did.
Well, they tried to take root, and then usually the roots were yanked up and sent somewhere else. But I mean, it's really interesting that the Colosseum.
I mean, there were unfortunate is a very mild way of putting it. Things that happened in the 20th century.
But long before that, the 20th century was just a culmination of. I mean that had been happening for, and I mean it's very interesting. You have really strong, for example, a really strong Jewish community in Spain in the early medieval period, and they were all thrown out by the very religious Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, exactly. And they were thrown out the same year that Columbus went to America. So 1492, big change in Spain.
Yeah.
So I found that interesting. And the wine stuff and the Roman stuff was really more the focus, but I think it was the me stuff was what brought those things together. I think, which is why the subtitle of the book is Wine, the Romans, and Me. It's not because it's all about me. It's because the genesis of this book was this idea of where the wines, the Romans, and the Jews all meet.
Fantastic. It sounds fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading it myself. And the book is now available, soon available?
The book is yes, it's out now in Australia. I think it's the supplies are actually coming in this week or next week. So apparently, I held my launch last night, and I was told that the books that were there are the first lot to get into Australia. But in the next week or two, it should be available in a good bookshop near you.
Fantastic. Well, I do encourage everyone to seek it out. And are there other places where people can find you online or in print media?
Yes, absolutely. I have a website, which is just ninakaplan.com. My articles in the New Statesman once a month. And they are, for the moment anyway, they are free to view online. So, although I think that might be changing. And I write in various places. I'm writing about Australia's wineries for National Geographic Traveller, so that should be out in the next few months. But I try and alert people on my website to what I'm doing in terms of print journalism. And
can people find you on social media?
They can definitely find me on social media. I'm on Twitter as Nina Kaplan. I'm on Instagram as Nina H. Kaplan. And in theory, I'm on Facebook as Nina Kaplan, but I'm more on Twitter and Instagram.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you very much for making some time. I do hope you have a lovely trip here. I believe you're heading over to South Australia as well. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us on this episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. I'm very excited to let you know that Nina's book is now available. If you go to the bloomsbury.com website and make sure you are set to Australia, you can actually get a 30% discount on her book until the end of May 2018. Simply enter the discount code IntrepidWino, lowercase, or one word, at purchase to get that discount. I heartily recommend the book. I've been reading it. It's fantastic. You can follow me on social media at Intrepid Wino on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And you can find the podcast on Twitter at The Vincast. You can find my YouTube channel, Intrepid Wino, one word, where I've got lots of different videos, including my Let's Taste series and also my own winemaking experiences under my burgeoning wine brand, Vino Intrepido. Please do subscribe, leave a comment on some videos. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to the podcast on any number of different podcast sharing apps and programs, such as iTunes, Player FM, Stitcher, Podbean, iHeartRadio. Subscribing means you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available. You can access the entire back catalogue. But also, it's a great way, for you to share your appreciation for my guests and for myself by leaving a rating and review. I really do appreciate any support and love hearing from my listeners. Of course, all that information is available on my website, intrepidwino.com, as well as a number of different ways to get in contact with me and different writing I've done in the past. I hope to have some more episodes for you coming very soon, but until then, bye.
Earbuds, Melbourne's podcast network. earbudsnetwork.com